Thanks, Will. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation to come and present about the vista beyond self-sovereignty. And I say beyond because the work of self-sovereignty is really important. We're developing some interesting tech, but as you'll see, I'm going to argue that it's not good enough. So I work with the AKASHA Foundation, founded by a lovely chap called Mihai Alesi, who used to work with Vitalik on Bitcoin magazine before Vitalik came up with the idea for Ethereum, and then they co-founded Ethereum together, which is now the largest global compute, if you like, of its kind. So I'm really privileged to be working with AKASHA on that mission, which is the socio-technical ramifications of blockchain technologies. If you like, it's where the carbon meets the silicon, and it should come together in a beautiful way. But as we know, it can also be a train wreck. So we're trying to work out how we can get this trajectory going in the right direction, rather than, well, the other way. Who's in the room? Can I just take a measure? Who's in the business of technology, operationalizing this kind of technology? Okay, that's about half. Who's a technologist? Okay, that's about half as well. Maybe some overlap. Sociologists. Psychologists. Thank you. Welcome. Ecologists. Anthropologists. One gentleman, thank you. Yikes. Complexity scientists. Love it. A little bit of an imbalance. It's just sometimes just one representative of some of these other disciplines. But the reason I'm asking is because this is a multi, or inter, or even transdisciplinary topic. And if we don't work with each other, if you'll excuse the language, we're gonna fuck up. We are dealing with the human condition here. There is nothing more central to our self than identity. And people have died through poor bureaucratization of identity in the past. People are dying today because of poor bureaucratization of identity. And I know there is no one in this room who wants to see their work lead to people dying through poor identity. And the interesting thing is, I've heard lots of good intentions today, but there is a phrase, of course, which you'll have heard, that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I've only heard 2 brief comments about the emergent qualities of the work we're doing here. Will, in his presentation, and Dave from MadeSafe. Lots about the user, the primacy of the individual, their sovereignty, putting them in the middle of a circle like there's some 3-year-old who thinks that they're continuing to be the center of the universe. This is not how the world works. For every complex problem, there are answers that are clear and simple, that grab people's attentions, but are plainly wrong. Do you and your colleagues have confidence that you're working on the right stuff? And I just love this man. Read everything he ever wrote as far as I'm concerned. He's just awesome. And just a wonderful multidisciplinary individual who pointed out that most of the problems that we're grappling with as a species are based on us not really understanding how the world works. We might project how we think it should work and engineer on that basis, but then we mess up because that's not how the world works. So my role this afternoon is to try and provide, if you like, a little bit of a counterposition to some of the nirvana, people have even used the word, stood here this afternoon, some of the nirvana that we think we're building, and point out why there's a dystopia waiting just behind it. And this is not me being alarmist. Look at the current situation of Web 2. Go back 12 years. People stood here presenting the wonders of Web 2. How many mentioned filter bubbles, fake news, the rise of political extremism? Very few, I'd imagine. So who are we doing this for? Because there's lots of mentions for the individual. And that's kind of like a response to the fact that at the moment it's big gov and big corp. So, you know, we need some balance. But I would argue to best serve the individual, we also have to serve the species. And in order to meet the species' best interests, we need to start with the individual. There's a reciprocation here, a self-defining dependency, very well known to sociologists under structuration theory. Never mentioned in a technology conference. And yet, I would put it to you, there's no one at this conference would disagree that that is not a bad vision for what we're trying to design here. We need to work out how, as 7 billion people flying spaceship Earth, we might continue to make it a nice place to hang out. We might become better custodians of it. We might work with nature rather than against it. That's why the AKASHA Foundation has been formed. We want to empower individuals, because only through their diversity and their agency might we get collective intelligence at a cultural, societal, species level. We're the first species that we know of anyway to have to grapple with a system at global scale. And there is surely no way we're going to do that in paradigms that say, I want to control my data, it's mine. Like a 3-year-old not wanting to share their toys. This stack is based on Margaret Wheatley's work. She looked at how organizations either thrive or just about survive or just die away. And she noted that identity is the sense-making entity. It's the one that sort of is the capacity for organizing. But equally, it overlaps with the information flows, the medium for the organizing, and of course, the relationships, because we are who we know. They're required for the transformation of that information into knowledge, knowledge into wisdom. And in actual fact, they're co-constitutive. Perhaps in another language I don't speak, there's only one word, because these three are so interlinked. Co-constitutive, reciprocally defining. You can't tease an identity away from the information, as recent presentations at the decentralized web camp in California would have it. You can't do that. That's just a logical impossibility. And equally, you can't imagine just taking a static snapshot of those three circles and think, I understand where we're at. Because it's the dynamism of the system that is its key characteristic. It's the flow. Which brings me to another 20th century hero of mine, Bucky Fuller. And I remember reading this some few decades ago thinking, what the hell does he mean? And it's only really in the last few years that it's just finally clicked for me. How many of you remember when you started your current job? Are you the same person now as then? How many of you know you're going to go home to a different context this evening and be the same person this evening as you've been today? How many of you remember the 5-year-old tottering off to school for the first time? Now, legal identity says you're the same all the way through. Your psychology says otherwise. It's implicit to the human condition that we have this malleability, this narrative, this dynamic, this multiplicity. And right now, we're just trying to engineer all that out, like it doesn't matter. To get to identity, I need to just first talk about data, because I've already said that they are so interlinked that to be able to talk about one without the other is bonkers. Here's a phrase, my data. You'll already have guessed by now that I don't particularly like the phrase my data. It does two things. It says it's data about me, and it says it's mine. It implies ownership. Now, I'm not the only one to think that the ownership or the propertization of data is immoral. The General Data Protection Regulator has an ethical supervisor, a lovely chap called Buttarelli. And Buttarelli compares ownership of data with the manifestation of markets for live human organs, right? I mean, you can't put it more viscerally than that. It's disgusting. If you talk to people who want to propertize data, it's because they haven't had the imagination to think about a world in which property doesn't immediately apply to everything. So it's not my data, it should be data about me. Now it describes the subject, but without inferring ownership. It's something over which I have agency, not control. If all of us have control over our data, that's a logical impossibility. Any cyberneticist can tell you that. But we have agency. And through it, I have agency. And with it, I become inseparable from this digitalization of our relationships. So this diagram is not a diagram. This is the Newtonian diagram. This just places the individual at the middle, reifies them, tells them wonderful things they'd like to hear, like you can control your identity, you can own your data. We can engineer for it. I'm just saying it'll be a disaster, because the world actually works a little bit differently. Looks a little bit like that. That's a harder architecture to sell in a conference, by the way. That's a little bit more challenging. But the one on the right is nature, that's how the world is. And the one on the left is how we'd like the world to be right now. And it doesn't matter how we'd like it to be, because that's how it is. Personal data only exists in law. There's a legal definition, if only to try and stem some of the abhorrent behaviors that emerged in the digital marketing realm. In reality, we're not like that. We're social animals. This isn't working. There we go. We're social animals. If you think about anything you might qualify as personal data under that definition, it's not. It's actually interpersonal data. Even something as personal as, say, my DNA. Think about it. It can't be my personal data. If I go and get my DNA mapped and publish it, I've betrayed the privacy of my parents, for example, and my siblings. Very, very little stuff is personal data. It's all interpersonal data. So let's have a quick comparison of the two, because on one hand, we're operating in an illegal environment, but hey, we work in nature. Personal data talks about data subjects. I prefer to talk about humans. I'm going to get a bit closer. There we go. Personal data is node-centric. I want it in my vault. Interpersonal data lives on the edge. Privacy-preserving, socially meaningful. One is about control, the other one's about agency, the other one's tree-like. Boy, do we love trees in the sciences. But it's actually what's known as rhizomatic, a little bit like that diagram, that messy picture I showed you earlier. One is about facsimile. Facsimile can never be master. Your bank's not going to trust your version of their data. And yet, it's our data because it's my relationship with the bank, showing my transactions with other parties. It's all interpersonal data. And data needs other data to breathe alongside, to become information, and information needs other information to become knowledge. So sticking it all in little personal vaults isn't going to do anyone any good at all. And fundamentally, interpersonal data must be both about privacy and collective intelligence. Because if it's not, we're just looking at the gift horse of the interwebs, the thing we so need at the moment. We've got some super wicked problems to deal with as a species, and we're going to just get it wrong. Right, we're on to identity. Fantastic. My favorite quote to introduce identity is from Phil Windley. Just a lovely thing to see here, because we're so used to, 400 years on, after the bureaucratization of identity, to think about identity as the bureaucratization of identity, not in terms of all of its other, softer, quotidian manifestations. And here, so we've heard already that there's no one definition of self-sovereignty, but this one is from Sovereign, so they're fairly central to the community. a term used to describe the digital movement that recognizes an individual should own and control their identity without the intervening administrative authorities. I like the very last bit. Don't like the first two-thirds. But let's break it down. Let's look at the founding principles of SSI, self-sovereign identity, and see if they stand the test of time. The first principle is existence. Users must have an independent existence. Flag number one, users, for fuck's sake. If you think about having users, you're in the wrong mind frame for inventing technology that's closest to the human condition you can possibly get. The only other industries that use the word user are the sex trade and the drugs trade, right? So let's talk about humans. And you might believe that identity is an object. It doesn't make it so. You can believe all you like. Ain't gonna make it any different. And as any sociologist, or student of cultural studies, or psychologist, or anthropologist, or complexity scientist will tell you, the I and the we are not separable. I am defined by my relationships. The second principle, control. This one goes back to 2005 and laws of digital identity that were developed at that time. So this has predates self-sovereign identity, but control is a logical impossibility. It's just, here we are in an environment. Who controls the temperature? Would you like it to go up or down? Well, we can't all control it, right? Agency, on the other hand, is a negotiation, recognizing our sociality as creatures. So other disciplines have been grappling with this problem long before us. So let's just work together. I'm a budding web scientist. I'm a technologist to start with, but I'm trying to be a web scientist, co-founded by Tim Berners-Lee, to be interdisciplinary. SSI, we're not doing very well on the SSI principles so far, right? This is not a good scorecard. Access. Users must have access to their own data. Well, there's an irony there, because to know that it's my data, it's got to be identified as me. Hang on a minute, there's a privacy issue there. You want to know whether they tracked you walking through King's Cross the other day, which was in the news recently? Well, you've got to make sure that they know that face is yours before they can tell you if your face was tracked. If you see me smack a child, I can't say, sorry, can you just take that out of your access archives, please, and pretend you didn't see that. I've got no right to ask others to change the way in which they choose to respond and recognize me. I don't have that right. It doesn't work like that in nature. And you all obviously know why I have a problem with their own. Persistence doesn't work either. Outside of the law, which has a necessary requirement to bureaucratize birth and bureaucratize death and try and have some connection between the two, outside of law, there is not one other discipline in which I've immersed myself, where I've found any kind of similar claim to persistence. None. Quite the opposite, in fact. This is now starting to sound like it's being forced on us, and it's really ill-fitting. Persistence is damaging. If I told you that you can only be the same as that 5-year-old, that's it, you are defined. Well, that sounds weird. How can I not change? Well, you can't. Because we've developed the technology which locks you in. One identity. It's yours, mate, own it. Hollywood gets this. They've made movies about it. How come the self-sovereign identity technology community hasn't got this? So here's some real flags when you know it's going wrong. You see the optional becoming the compulsory. We do it for the individual, but then it becomes structured. Aadhaar in India being a case in point. An identity system. No, it's not, because now 1.23 billion people are enrolled. If you're one of the last 0.1 billion to go, you're excluded from society. On the topic of including and excluding, you can't develop for one without developing for the other. I've seen a lot of SSI presentations saying they want to include people in the democratic process. Brilliant. You're also inventing the basis to exclude people from the democratic process. To revisit the clear, simple, and wrong, which I started this presentation with, Vlad gets it. Vlad's, you probably can't see it there, or maybe you can, tweeting that saying, blimey, there's some really naive social understanding amongst these crypto people. Really? I mean, seriously. Then the chap pops up and says, yeah, but crypto's really hard for these social scientists. I couldn't help myself. I had to respond and say, well, actually, social science is really hard for these crypto kiddies. And to be fair, he did actually give me a heart to respond to that. So Bojan understands, I think, that this has to be an interdisciplinary effort. If there's one facet of information technology where move fast and break things isn't appropriate, it's identity, core to the human condition. Going back to structuration, I'd like to port my eBay seller rating, please, to my Airbnb host profile. I'd like to do that. Instant reputation. I've earned it. I'm a good lad. What's not to like? Verifiable claims, W3C working group. Let's get that going. That's awesome. Except that enabling universal reputation scoring is dystopian. Once one person's done it, it's expected. And if you don't do it, you're excluded. And then before you know it, you've created through emergence the very thing the Chinese have deliberated on, creating a mass state surveillance machinery. We just got there a little bit more efficiently through emergence instead of deliberation. Is this the world we want to design? Because that's the one we're making. Path dependencies. I won't, let's move on. Friction. We heard earlier, Evonym removing friction from the system. The phrase papers, please, is associated with police states. Now, I live in a society where I'm not asked for my identity to buy a bagel, to flag a cab, to play in the park, to do a mate a favour. None of these things. But if we move the friction out from asking, then some will ask, and some will comply. So some others will ask, and so some others will comply. And you can see where that goes. Friction is an important system property. Yes, frictionless, free, endless copying is a feature, not a bug of the interwebs. This is wonderful. But let's be careful on how we just apply it. I then separate identity into two concepts. One, a noun-like. These are the ones with which every technologist is familiar, because these are the ones that they're designing. And the verb-like. The noun-like don't change. By design, actually. I've only got the one birth certificate. If I lost it, I can get another one reissued. Bit of a challenge, but that's because there's this kind of a copy back there somewhere. I've got passport, kind of just gets updated every 10 years because my biometric, my face changes. These things don't change by design, and they're used on rare occasion. The verb-like are every living moment of our lives. And yet I've been in presentations today where there's 15, 20 different facets of life where we can get this amazing identity systems to change things up. It's like a disease. We're going to be infected. We won't be able to move. We won't be able to respond and grow as individuals. It's not generative, it's degenerative. That's what's going to happen if we get this wrong. This one, which we think is quite hard to design for technologically, is actually a lot easier to design technologically than that one. So we'll do that one, and that one will get squished. Your psychological safety is at risk. In fact, one of the biggest psychological problems you might have is anxiety about your personal safety in this kind of outcome. At AKASHA, we believe that generative identity is essential, in fact, existential, at all of those levels, from the individual's psychological safety to societal well-being, if you like, but also to our living in harmony with nature, to ecological health. And we've got a number of principles that we're playing with. Right now, we're trying to forge the questions to ask rather than trying to provide the answers. But we're happy to spend some time doing that, and we are pleading with the rest of the community, identity community, to do just the same. Just hit pause, will you guys, because and gals, because this is not going in the right direction. Generative identity principle number 1 is change. You can't cater for collective intelligence to emerge. You can't cater for emergence at all if you rule out the ability for change. Principle number 2 is co-constitution. We are not separating interpersonal data and identity. They are co-emergent, co-reliant, reciprocally defining, co-constitutive, whatever. They're just inseparable. There's an omnidirectionality here, which is a little bit tricky to get your head around, because there are no inputs and outputs. There's just movement and flows of data. It's a continual flux. There are no data vaults, no data banks. Anything that implies something you store stuff in is the wrong analogy altogether. Not sure how we're going to do this one, to be honest, no idea. I know that it probably won't be done in technical code. I know that we'll need societal norms and legal code to play a part as well. If you're familiar with Larry Lessig's codes of cyberspace, it all needs to be in the mix in order to reintroduce some of the frictions that have been essential to the human condition and societal health and ecological health to date. And finally, the complete mind twister for the software engineer, God bless him, is that you can have generativity or you can have universality. You cannot have both. So if we want the facility to continue to grow as individuals, grow as cultures, grow as societies, grow as a species in harmony, then we have to dismiss universality. We have to go down a layer and produce some protocols that allow others to instantiate those protocols in ways that suit their way of seeing the world, their ways of being in that particular moment in time. Interpersonal data and generative identity is way bigger than the AKASHA. Well, there's only 15 of us in the foundation, right? We are going to make no difference whatsoever by ourselves, which is why we love opportunities like this to come and address some audiences who will get this. I don't believe there's anything I've said there that's spiel or right? I feel like everybody gets it here because everybody's in the room with good intentions. So let's have this conversation and see if we can channel those good intentions in ways that are good for our psychological health, our societal health, and our ecological health. Thanks very much for listening.